Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a Q&A session this morning. Not a very long section that we're going to go, our session we're going to do today, but somebody asked a question this week about politics and why people support certain politicians, so I want to take the time to talk through that with you and just give you some thoughts from a Christian. So the question was, why people support bad politicians? Like, why is it, especially that Christians support politicians who support issues that Christians would not agree with. So this obviously in a time where we're all quarantined, we're all looking at our computers a whole lot more. We're on Facebook probably more than we normally would be. We're engaged with the political conversation more, and I think it's obvious to us that there's a lot of turmoil in politics right now, and that people are disagreeing about a lot of issues, and politicians obviously are making a whole bunch of mistakes, as any of us would, because you're trying to figure out a situation that you've never figured out before. So there's a lot of disagreement on these things. So what should we do if we're a Christian and we see another Christian maybe on Facebook supporting a politician who we know supports something that would not be in line with Christian values? That's kind of the essence of the question. So I guess, first of all, what we need to talk about is Christian engagement in politics. What does that look like? To what level is that okay or not okay? And the place to start with this is probably an unpopular place for some people, and that is that if you're not engaged, at least in some way, with the politics of your area of the world, your country or your municipality, if you are not at least engaged in some way, I believe that's not taking care of your neighbor. That's not caring for the people around you who are going to be affected by the policies enacted by a government of any sort. And so the idea that some people have, and I think this is more popular with younger generations, but it goes to all generations, that like you don't want to engage with politics. You just want to sort of let it go and just forget about it, and I don't care. Like, that's not okay, because you're abandoning your neighbor who is going to be affected by whatever happens. So you have that on the one side, right? Like you can't disengage. On the other side, there's a level that engagement goes a little too far, and that has more to do with your attitude towards what you think government does and to what extent it has a claim on your life. So Christians, we understand that God puts governments in place. He chooses who he wants to be in power for the sake of his church, for the sake of the good of humanity. And so we honor and respect those in authority. However, in our context, at least as Westerners, so in North America, we have the ability to critique our elected officials. That's built into the way that both Canada and the United States' governments are structured. So we do have the ability to go after them and hold them accountable for whatever they're doing. And Christians ought to do that. We ought to be thoughtful about what our government is doing so that we can be, again, taking care of our neighbor and holding those whom we've put in positions of power to do that accountable for what they're doing. Where we get into trouble is where we start to make politics into our God. We change our attitude towards politics so that we expect politics to do what God should be doing for us. And that's where we get into trouble. So if you are engaged in politics in such a way that you try to manufacture an outcome, and if politics doesn't come to that conclusion, you're very irritated, or you're very despondent, or you feel like you've lost, well, then you're forcing your worship to go towards politics instead of God. Like, nations rise and nations fall, and the Christian church continues to go on in different contexts, different situations with different challenges. And whether the governments that we have right now are going to be supportive or they're going to be against Christianity, at the end, it doesn't matter, right? God is king. God will take care of us. God will provide what our churches need in times of crisis. So if we're engaging in politics and then we feel like if things don't go our way, then everything is going to go to pot. We're just going to lose. We're putting too much pressure on politics to be our God, to be our provider. So you have these two ends of the spectrum, right? So what's the happy medium? Well, I don't think I can tell you. I think you kind of have to figure that out for yourself. You have to try to find a balance where you are not projecting your worship to politics, and you are also not disengaging with politics. So with all that said, what do you do when you encounter somebody who doesn't see that the way that they are engaging in politics is actually harmful to their neighbor? So they're supporting a candidate or supporting a policy that is going to be harmful to people. First of all, let's just understand that no policy is perfect, right? In fact, the idea that like a country would legislate Christian values is probably not too wise either, because what eventually happens is Christians start to identify with the values, the way of living, rather than the message of Christianity, the gospel that Jesus has died for the sins of the world. And then Christianity becomes essentially moralism. You'd be amazed at how many people think Christianity is just about being a good person. Like that's probably the criticism I run into most as a pastor, that people just think, well, Christianity is about being a good person, and you're not following Christianity's, whatever teachings. And that's just not, that's not the main message of Christianity. Yes, like being saved by grace makes you want to do good to your neighbor, but that's not the main message of Christianity. So if we have a government that legislates moral values, Christian moral values, they may be helpful, and may be right in the sense of helpful for our neighbor, but let's not push them just because they're Christian. Let's push them because they're good for our neighbor. In fact, I would say as much as possible, let's dissociate Christianity with those laws, right? Even though they are congruent, they are the same. Let's disassociate them, because doing good to your neighbor is the role of government. It's to make sure that we do good to each other. But it's not powered by Christianity, the religion. So find somebody who has got a policy that you disagree with. What do you do? Well, first of all, it's not okay for them to be ignorant of the issue. And in a lot of cases, I would guess that's probably the problem, is that the person is ignorant that politician or that policy is harmful to their neighbor. So your role, if you see somebody who's supporting a policy or a politician that's not helpful to the neighbor, is to inform them. Now, how you inform them is very important, because yelling on Twitter or Facebook is like, that's never worked. I don't know why we think that works. That never works. It only serves to drive people deeper into what they already believe. So if you're a Christian, going to another person and saying, here's the issue with what I see you doing. Can we talk about this from a Christian perspective? Brother or sister in Christ to brother or sister in Christ. And they may be thankful, right? Wow, I didn't know that person supported that. On the other hand, they might just not care. They may just say, I don't want to hear about that. I don't want to talk about that. They might yell back at you. They might fight back. So two things about that. First of all, that's just, what are you going to do with a person like that? Like you can't convince somebody who has decided I will not be convinced. And I think it's okay at that point to just say, you know what? I can't convince you. I'm going to love you as a neighbor and as a fellow Christian. But right now, what I'm doing can't convince you of something else. And maybe you need, certainly they do. They need God to step in and change their attitude in some way. So you gotta be patient with people, because being a Christian is not something any of us ever really perfect. We're all sinful all the time, even when we've been Christians for a long time. And we're all idiots. Like, being sinful doesn't just mean we sin. It also means that we don't know how to operate correctly. And so having a reasonable conversation is hard. It's hard for a lot of people. So if you do get them to engage in the conversation, the most important thing to do is to listen, because just telling them your opinion doesn't change their mind. Even if you're kind about it, even if you're patient with it, you have to first help them understand their own position before you help them understand your position. So this means deconstructing, in a sense, their worldview and getting them to think about it in a different way. So asking a lot of questions, listening a lot. You might say, okay, so tell me, why do you support such and such? How do you think that helps other people or helps our neighbors? What about this? Would this be a side effect? What about this group of people? How do you think they're going to be affected? And then you can have a really good dialogue if you're willing to ask questions. Most of us are not willing to ask questions. We just want to yell at each other. But if you're willing to ask questions and listen, you'll find actually that you have quite a bit of success in building bridges. So that's my strategy, I guess. But you got to do it personally. And you can't do it through Facebook. You can't do it through Twitter. You got to go to that person and say, I love you as a Christian brother or sister in Christ. And then check your heart as you do it too. Like, am I doing this again because politics is my God and I just want everything to go the way that I want it to go, and I'm going to force this person into this? Or I need to win. Sometimes we just need to win the argument. We need to feel like we're doing a good thing. So watch that. Are you really doing it selflessly for the sake of helping your neighbor? And then finally, remember that even if you don't convince them, and even if the whole thing goes wrong and people suffer because of governments, remember that people have suffered because of governments before. And Jesus is still king. And Jesus is not here to give us a prosperous life. As North Americans, we've had such a prosperous life that we think that if we just keep the politics right, we're going to continue to have a prosperous life. No, we've had prosperity because God has been good to us and not stopped us from having prosperity. And he's been generous and patient with us despite all the sin and despite all the evil and despite all the backstabbing and all the terrible things that we do. So be thankful that we have had as much prosperity as we have had. And if we don't, be okay with the fact that Jesus is the king and we'll be fine. I think that's all I really wanted to say on that. It's hard for me to have a conversation about politics from a Christian point of view because people tend to think immediately that Christians are, well, usually conservative, right? Like that's the stereotype. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not. I'm not all conservative, and I'm not all liberal. And I think that's because there are some things that line up with Christian values that the liberal agenda has, at least as its motivation, and there are things that the conservative agenda has as Christian supportive value things. You see, I'm a political pundit. So I don't know. I just don't think you can. I don't think you can make such blanket statements about politics. There are bad politicians on both sides of the aisle because there are sinners on both sides of the aisle. There are bad policies on both sides because sinners made those policies. So as a Christian, engage, vote, talk, ask questions, pray for your politicians because that's what God tells us to do. And then be patient and let God be the true king who rules over all the rulers. And we'll be fine. I'm not sure if that's helpful, but that's the beauty of these Saturday Q&A sessions is I can just tell you what I'm thinking and you can respond to it. So I'm going to check my monitor and see if anybody said anything. Turns out they didn't. So if you watch this, thank you for taking the time to watch it. And if you found it beneficial, let me know. If you have any questions, put them in the comments of this video or send me an email at caleb.schultz caleb.schultz@crossoflife.net. Thanks, and I hope you have a great weekend.